let me ask you, do you have a sort of a favorite book or a set of books that you typically recommend for folks who are trying to grow in their own Catholic life of faith?
Tom, I especially notice when we are, like when a private retreatant will come and request spiritual direction, and sometimes we'll have someone come for 2 weeks, and I've already got a setup of all the spiritual direction, so I have to squeeze them in wherever. But typically they'll need a book or two, and I'll bring them to our library, which is upstairs. It's a second floor set of books that mostly have been given to us. But, the classics of the spiritual life are really good to look back on and have, a relationship with, if you will. In the convent, we had to read all the spiritual classics, like Garrigou-Lagrange, the spiritual life. It was like
the 3 ages of the spiritual life or something like that.
Oh my goodness, that was such a heavy tome. And you're not really ready for that when you're 20 or 21 years old. But I think going back and reading the works that I read when I was younger has really helped me. Looking at the intensity of those books, I think that earlier in my religious life, the intense books, I always liked the biographies of the saints. Those were way easier for me to read. And also I felt a kinship with those saints. And the neat thing about saints is when you read about a story of a saint, you don't just think of them as a time in time past. You have a relationship with that person. Saint Anthony of Padua has always been a huge favorite of mine, but I got my devotion to him when I was at home, and I had a relic of him that I safeguarded. In our family, Mom always said, all right, if we ever have a fire, what are we going to go rescue? My brothers automatically said the dogs. And I said, well, Daisy, my dog, I would get, Mom. And she said, but you're in charge of what? And I said, the relics, Mom. So we had 5 family relics that were passed down through our family. And I think they're in a religious house now. I don't remember what happened to them. But that is something that kind of sharpens your understanding of the relationship that we have with these older brothers and sisters and the Lord. But, in the convent, I read Story of a Soul. That's always like your first book. And I had read this when I was maybe 14 years old. When I was 12, I read The Way of Divine Love, which is a very heavy book. But I was reading it and I found out that the nun in that book was in love with Jesus. And at that time, I was thinking, oh, she's like talking about Jesus like a boyfriend. That's weird. And as I was reading the book, I realized it was too old for me, but I was also interested in the intellectual information there. But I read later in a Father Lasance book for girls, it said, don't give girls stories of religious falling in love with God until a certain age, because they're not going to understand it and they'll be turned off. And I was like, hey, that was me. And it didn't occur to me until way later that I was going to be in love with our Lord. It was after I had already determined God had invited me to religious life. And it was only then that I realized Jesus is going to be my spouse. And I thought, oh, that's not gross at all. That's really cool. And but the Story of a Soul that I read when I was 14 or so, I look at that book. I looked at that book as a 21 or 22-year-old. And as I read it, I really got inside the story so much better. But it wasn't until like 4 years ago when I was working on my certification for spiritual direction, which I had been doing for years anyway, but I did get the cert afterwards. I read it again and I was so elevated in soul. I don't know, it's hard to explain. It was like God I was like, Therese, I get it. Oh my goodness, you are so wonderful. And I just love you and thank you. And I'm so glad we have a relationship. She led me to read this book on a paper that I was doing. And that book really, it's got different layers that you only pick up at certain points in your life. Another really good book is A Grief Observed.
Before you do that, I want to just say this. So for folks who are not aware, and I'm guessing most people are, The Story of a Soul is the autobiography of the little flower, Saint Therese of Lisieux, a Discalced Carmelite religious sister who lived in the late 1800s, and she died when she was 24 from tuberculosis, not tuberculosis.
Yes, no, it was tuberculosis.
Tuberculosis, yes.
Yes.
And she wrote it under obedience to her older sister, who was her mother superior. And the book had an incredible impact after she died. It was her reputation for holiness. And then it was one of the most read books in the 20th century, which is really very striking. And so not surprising, sister, that as a young religious, you'd have read that book, or as a young lady even. It was one of the first books that I read as well when my faith came alive in my late teen years. And yes, but please, now you talked about a grief observed.
Yes, that is C.S. Lewis. And I read that in college. I was able to take the Faith and Reason course over at Gonzaga for my philosophy master's. And in doing so, I was allowed to participate in one of the most scintillating and heart-filling experiences of my life, and hearing both Dr. Doug Crease and Father Robert Spitzer join up and take us through faith and reason, the two wings which carry us in our religious, our spiritual, our lives. And that faith is without reason is fideism, and reason without faith is rationalism. But we need reason and faith. And to hear the wisdom of these two wonderful professors, who also happened to be my spiritual director, Father Spitzer, too. I could hear him. In fact, his talk at Gonzaga was he just did it this week. It was just amazing. But A Grief Observed really opened my eyes to how we can think we know who God is. And when we experience a terrible trauma in life, like the loss of someone we love, for example, as in the case of C.S. Lewis, his whole understanding of God just fell apart like a pack of cards. And he had never felt so unable to understand what faith really was. And I think for me, I was ready. I was tuned in. It was a book that was just perfect for me at that time. And it helps me in doing spiritual direction to understand when a person is like at a loss. It's like, and also something else that should be known about spiritual direction, people who are in their later years will sometimes suddenly realize, I don't have any feeling in my prayer. I don't really know if I really love God. We start asking ourselves questions like, am I really a Catholic? Do I have a relationship with God? C.S. Lewis didn't know. He was so lost at this point that to direct someone through that would take an art and a skill. And it's very important to know that ahead of time, that this is not something that we would expect in the later years of our lives. But in many cases, many saints have gone through this. And St. Therese herself felt completely abandoned by God at the end. And her last words were, Jesus, I love you. And she said, I don't care, whatever my mind is telling me. She was very ill, and she still had a smile on her face, and you couldn't really tell that she felt abandoned by God. She was in spiritual darkness, just like St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila. Mm-hmm. Wow, it's a very powerful event.
Well, so again, I'm talking with Sister Mary Eucharista, so beautifully sharing insights into some of her favorite works that she recommends. And that's interesting because if you said, I'm going to pick a book by C.S. Lewis, I don't know if I even would have gotten down to A Grief Observed, right? There's so many books he's written that have had such big impact on people's lives. Mere Christianity, Screwtape Letters, The Great Divorce, Letters to Malcolm on Prayer, Miracles, the
Narnia
Four Loves,
series.
Chronicles of Narnia, right? Yes, the Space Trilogy.
Yes.
Yeah.
I've read them. I've read most of those. And out of all of them, I guess I was just in a point of my life. And plus, in between, I was working so hard. We had just come into full communion. I was working hard at Gonzaga on my master's, and I was also working hard at the retreat center on a new job that I'd been a high school teacher for so many years that this was a complete switchover, plus starting a new community. It was just like everything was so much. There was way too much going on in my life, but A Grief Observed stands out in a very particular way. I hope people will pick it up and read it.
Yeah, it refers to a part of his life that most people don't really think about, and that was that he ended up getting married later in life, and it's about the death of his wife Joy, and so that is that the book is very striking. I didn't remember it having the same impact on me that it's had on you, but I love the fact, sister, that you're connecting it to an aspect or a stage in the journey of faith that many older Catholics go through. I was aware of, the intense darkness or spiritual attacks that come upon certain saints at the end of their lives, but not as much that sense of like the desert, the darkness, the dryness, and the questioning that can happen to, let's call them seasoned citizens, like longtime Catholics who are now maybe empty nesters, maybe widows or widowers, or even just at a stage in their lives where they lack maybe energy and verve and all of that, and that can have an overflow effect on their spiritual life. I really, frankly, hadn't really read or thought much about that. I'm getting closer to it, but I haven't really thought that much about it. That's a really interesting insight.
And, I also want to put a word in. We mentioned states of life, and there's also dedicated single life, which people have been in. And before reaching that decision of a person to say, I am going to live my life as a single person, sometimes they can get into deep depression or darkness, or a time of spiritual desert where they are really tested. And that's something that I think we need to also remember, that they have a place in those states of life, and that they don't have partners or people that will be inviting them in for social events, and that they can experience a lot of darkness as well. And that's something that we need to be, and even young unmarried people who are looking for a partner, can't find a partner, have prayed all their lives for a partner, and don't know what God has in store for them. And that kind of desert experience is also there for them, and they need a little bit of encouragement and help.